symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Happy Sunday, August 9th, 2020. Great that all of you can join us virtually, remotely, on this Sunday morning. Today is our 7th event in our 2020 Summer Forum Speaker Series. Our 7th speaker today is Rod Decker. Rod was a highly visible and dynamic TV political reporter in Salt Lake City with Channel 2 KUTV for over 40 years. He covered the Utah State Legislature, political campaigns and government actions, and public controversies. He earned a degree in political science from the University of Utah, attended the University of Chicago, and spent a year at Harvard. His book, Utah Politics, The Elephant in the Room, is an exciting read for political junkies. The title of Rod's presentation this morning is Mormons, Morals, and Utah Politics. When Rod concludes his presentation, we will take 1 minute for the offering. True, today we are meeting unconventionally, virtually, remotely, but spiritually we are meeting within the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City, Utah. After the offering, Rod will be happy to engage in a lively Q&A period until 11 o'clock. You all know that there's no such thing as a bad question. Please type your questions into the Q&A and I will present them. So Rod, welcome. This Zoom format is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. As Tim says, I was a television news reporter, and I retired 3 years ago and thought I'd become a Utah historian in retirement. And I've learned about history. The thing I've learned most was summed up in a novel by Kingsley Amis called Lucky Jim. Jim's a graduate student in history. The first sentence of his thesis is, "No one knows why English shipbuilding between 1485 and 1500 has received so little attention." Journalists deal with hot issues of the day. Historians deal with old stuff. It's hard to get people interested. So I'm very grateful to you all that you'd come and listen. Thank you very much. George Bernard Shaw said, people who are striving to become respectable never talk about religion, politics, and sex. But people who have it made, who are clearly respectable, seldom talk about anything else. This is the First Unitarian Church. Are Unitarians respectable? Well, I think the most Utah Unitarian story I know concerns President William Howard Taft, President 1908, 1912. He visited Utah. He was a Unitarian. He was scheduled to meet with the Unitarians, but the leader of the Unitarians, the minister, was a socialist. The president heard that, Republican President William Howard Taft, and suddenly he discovered a prior appointment and did not meet with the Unitarians. Since then, the Unitarians have helped build Friendship Manor, the Salt Lake Acting Company of Saturday's voyeur fame or infamy. They held their first production in the Unitarian Church. Planned Parenthood of Utah held its first meeting in the Unitarian Church. Unitarians are surely respectable, and to the extent that they aren't 100% Utah respectable, it's not because they're trying to become respectable, it's because they're trying to become a little less Utah respectable. This talk will be about religion, politics, and sex. Let's take politics first. Utah politics are Republican and conservative. Everybody knows that. In the past 11 presidential elections since 1976, Utahns have been the most Republican state in 7 of those elections. While Utah is unusually Republican, what makes Utah unique, the most important fact about Utah politics is this: Utah is Republican solely on religious grounds, solely because of Latter-day Saints. In all of the presidential elections since 1984, when we first had exit polls and data of this sort, Utah Latter-day Saints have voted on average 73% Republican in all those presidential elections. Non-Mormons, everybody else, are Democrats. If only non-Mormon votes had counted, then Utah would have been the strongest Democratic state for Al Gore in 2000. Barack Obama would have buried Mitt Romney in Utah. Utah would have been the 5th most Democratic state for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Ronald Reagan would have won in Utah, but no other Republican president since. Utah has the most religiously polarized electorate of any state. And since 1976, Utah has been strongly Republican, and it is divided, unlike any other state, along religious lines. Now, I say since 1976 because before then it was different. Utah was politically normal. Now, it takes an effort of the imagination, I admit, to think of Utah as politically normal. But consider this: from statehood, 1896, to 1972 presidential election, 20 presidential elections, Utah voted with American majorities, that is for the winner, 17 times. Only 3 states voted for more winners in those 20 elections than Utah. Utah moved with American majorities. Moreover, as Utahns made national decisions, the state decisions usually followed in the same way. So when Utahns voted for McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, Republican presidents in Washington, Utah had Heber Wells and John Cutler and William Spry, Republican governors in Utah. When Utahns voted for Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman for president, we had Henry Blood and Herbert Ma, Democratic governors and Democratic legislatures in Utah. Utah was one of the states most in the American political mainstream. Why did that change? What happened? Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me. Between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Up till then, there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Suddenly the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same. Every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. That's Annus Mirabilis by Philip Larkin. And as he says, across Europe, England, in America, sexual mores, sexual morality changed, centering on the 1960s. Behavior changed. If you were an American woman born in 1942, you had a 30% chance of having sex outside marriage before you were 21. If you were born in 1955, you had a 72% chance of having sex outside marriage before you were 21. As behavior changed, opinions changed too. In 1969, 2/3 of Americans who had an opinion thought that sex outside marriage was always wrong or almost always wrong. By 1980, fewer than 1/3 held that opinion. As sex changed, families changed. Americans married less. In 1960, 72% of American adults were married. In 2014, Pew survey, 48% of American adults were married. As they married less, Americans had more sex outside marriage. They cohabited more. In 1960, census workers saw cohabiting couples for the first time they'd ever seen them. They didn't know what to call them. They held meetings. They argued about names. Finally, they decided on persons of opposite sex sharing living quarters. A government abbreviation, POSSLQ, which led to Charles Osgood's, "There is nothing I wouldn't do if you would be my POSSLQ." The number of POSSLQs increased. In 1990, finally, they changed it to cohabiting couples. The most important change, the most important statistic may be this: children born out of marriage. 1960, less than 5% of American children were born outside marriage. 2015, 42%. That's about the percentage now were born outside marriage. As you'll remember, the poem said, "Everyone felt the same." That's poetic license. Not everyone felt the same. Latter-day Saints didn't feel the same. They resisted the sexual revolution. As traditional families of a married man and woman and their children went down in America, they went up in Latter-day Saint preaching. Two brothers who were sociologists, Gordon and Gary Shepard, analyzed every general conference talk ever given. They found that from 1950 to 1979, family was the 8th most important topic in Latter-day Saint General Conference. But from 1980 to 2009, Latter-day Saint families, traditional families, were the 2nd most important topic in Latter-day Saint General Conference. Only Jesus Christ was more important. As their leaders preached traditional families, Latter-day Saints lived in traditional families more than other Americans. You remember, in the United States, 48% of adults are married. That same Pew survey showed that of Latter-day Saints, 66% of adults are married. And in Utah, 60% of adults are married. Latter-day Saints are the most married religion in America. Utah is the most married state in America. There was a traditional morality that supported traditional families. Some of you may remember. The traditional morality said, the only sex that's moral is sex between a married man and a woman. Latter-day Saints believe that traditional morality, and they live it more than other Americans. General Social Survey asked, 78% of Americans say they have had sex outside marriage. 40% of Latter-day Saints say they have had sex outside marriage. Besides affecting the families, Latter-day Saint resistance to American social change affected demography among Latter-day Saints and in Utah. If you don't have sex outside marriage, you have a good reason to get married. Latter-day Saints marry young, the youngest of any religion. Utahns marry young, usually the youngest of any state. If you marry young, you have more children. Fertility delayed is fertility denied, say demographers. Latter-day Saints have the most children of any American religion. Utah usually has the highest birth rate and the highest fertility of any state. What do you call a man in Orem with 2 children? Impotent. So many children make Utah the youngest state. Utah has the youngest population of any state. Besides affecting demography, Latter-day Saint resistance to social change affected politics. Now you'll remember I said that the current regime of strong republicanism based on religion came from, started in 1976. That was the presidential election after Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision that struck down state abortion laws, including Utah's abortion law. Political scientists have studied the electoral effects of Roe v. Wade. They say that it changed American politics with respect to religion. After Roe v. Wade, evangelicals, Latter-day Saints, Pentecostals, members of strict conservative religions became Republican, and they became part of the Republican base. The change was particularly pronounced in Utah. Before 1976, as I said, Utah was politically normal. After 1976, Utah was the first time ever in history that Utah voted most strongly for any presidential candidate. Since then, most strongly Republican in 7 of 11 elections. Things changed. The change especially affected Utah. In America, Latter-day Saints, evangelicals, Pentecostals, together are about 22% of voters. In Utah, Latter-day Saints are almost 2/3 of voters. What was an important change in America was an overwhelming change in Utah. It determines political outcomes, and 44 years later, it still determines political outcomes. Now, Roe v. Wade was a trigger or tipping point, but it certainly wasn't the start. The sexual revolution started back in the 1960s or before, and it certainly wasn't the end. Those of you who've been in Utah in recent decades will remember that we fight over morals here in this state. We have, maybe more than anywhere else, we have fights over public morality. And over the past 40 years or so, we have fought over abortion, over pornography, over censoring cable television, over government supplying birth control to teens without telling their parents, and most recently, over same-sex marriage. Now, in all of those arguments, they went on for years in Utah, every one of them did, and then Utah made a decision in the civics textbook way. We argued and debated and had sometimes referendums, or sometimes elections, and the legislature passed a law, probably reflecting majority LDS opinion. Those laws, every one of them, were struck down by federal judges. Utahns made a decision, and federal judges said, no, that's not the decision. Utah Latter-day Saints, who supported those laws, became and remained strongly Republican. Republicans were the party more, not the difference was degree, but more in favor of the old morality. Republicans were the party less in favor of growing federal power to decide those issues. Non-Mormons faced a seemingly permanent religious political juggernaut. They became Democrats, and that's been the pattern in Utah. The judges who made those decisions, they invoked American values of liberty and equality. None of the decisions forced anybody to do anything. If you want, you could still have sex only in marriage and have a traditional family. Democrats, Republicans, many Americans still have traditional families. But in addition, you might have an abortion or look at pornography or have a same-sex marriage. And all of those decisions are equal before the law. Those judicial decisions expanded American freedom and equality, the freedom of the young and others to have sex as they pleased, equality especially for women and for LGBTQ people. The Latter-day Saint resistance to American social change has a lot of other effects too. I want to mention one of them. I said 42% of American children are born out of marriage. In Utah, that's only 19%, less than half. Utah is the state with the lowest percentage of children born out of marriage. And it has been for decades, since 1960, when I looked every year. Children born out of marriage have disadvantages. The chief one is that they are about 5 times more likely to be poor. Poor children have difficulties. They are, in America, they are more likely to be abused, more likely to have trouble at school, trouble with the police, health problems. Utah, partly because it has fewer children born out of marriage, has about 40% fewer poor children than it would if it had the poor children at the national rate. 40% less, and that's been true since 1986, when they first began publishing these data annually. So progressives want more government help to mitigate problems for poor children, and they may get it after the next election, maybe. But up till now, traditional families, and perhaps Utah's reliance on them, work may be better for poor children than the alternative. I'll sum up. America changed sexual and family morality. Latter-day Saints resisted that change. As part of that resistance, they live differently from other Americans, they believe differently with respect to sex and families, and they vote differently. They became strongly Republican as a result of this. The Latter-day Saint Republicanism determines Utah elections. Utah votes Republican for president, and it trickles down throughout Utah government, and Utah is among the most Republican and conservative states in America. Religion, politics, and sex. What are we to think of this? No one knows why English shipbuilding receives so little attention, but I think we know why this doesn't receive much attention. To my mind, the religious division in Utah is the most important enduring political fact, but it's not mentioned very much. Republicans don't mention it because winning by religion is sort of suspect in America. The Constitution says no establishment of religion. Utah's Constitution says no religion shall dominate the state. And Republicans don't want to talk about it. Democrats aren't interested in talking about it. They hope to win a few elections and maybe more, and they're going to need Latter-day Saint votes. They don't say Latter-day Saints don't vote Democratic. Religious political division isn't something that you wish on a place. Think of say, Ireland or Israel. But we're, as nearly as I can tell, I don't have data, we're fairly civil here in Utah. We're reasonably polite in our politics, especially considering that it's a religious political division. Many of you have felt exasperation at Utah's obdurate republicanism. Nonetheless, most of you choose to live here. And so even though we might wish that Utah politics were different in some way or other, I think most of us still think that it's a good place to live. I'll take any questions.
Okay. Rod, thank you. Okay, everyone, let's take 1 minute as promised for the offering, and then we'll go to questions and answers. 1 minute. Okay, we now have the opportunity for questions and answers. Please type your questions into the Q&A and I'll present them to Rod. And Rod, I'm going to begin. I'll pose the first question. Your book, Utah Politics, The Elephant in the Room, has 354 pages, 17 chapters, a bibliography of 54 pages, and 15 pages of footnotes. It's very well researched. And I'm going to ask you a historical question that covers 125 years from 1896 when Utah became a state until this year. 125 years. Professor J.D. Williams at the University of Utah, you and I both studied with him. I asked him, why is it that the LDS Church has exerted such a strong control, influence upon the state legislature from the beginning of statehood? And he said, Tim, you have to understand that members of the LDS Church in Illinois and Missouri were threatened and killed. And so that helped to explain why they left the country for Mexico, for Utah. And he said that because they did not control the politics, the government, the laws of Illinois and Missouri, they made a promise in knowing history to control the politics and the laws in Utah. And so my question to you is, have you heard other legislators say that? And do you agree with that historical interpretation?
Legislators don't say that. Legislators talk about religion as little as they can. Now, it's surely the case that there's a long history that you recounted in part of conflict between Latter-day Saints and others. And nowadays, it's kind of funny. We smile when we think of it. Back before, it was persecutions and killings and jailings and Mountain Meadows massacre and terrible things on both sides. In Utah territory, Utah's first legislatures in church, whether you know that the church authorities say all who will sustain Russell Nelson, as president of the church, raised their hand, and everybody raises their hand unanimously. First legislatures were the same way. There were whole legislative sessions without a single negative vote on any question or issue. So yes, there's a historical dimension. But the main thing is the Utah legislature. I talked about how Utah voters are Latter-day Saint voters are Republican. The legislature is Utah politics writ large, or maybe squeezed down kind of into, there have been surveys of legislative religion. The last one showed 88% of the legislature is Latter-day Saint, compared to about 60% of the population. You mentioned over history. As nearly as I could tell, there have been 5 surveys of Latter-day Saint religion I could find, and all of them, the 5 surveys of the legislature's religion, all of them showed big Latter-day Saint majorities. Not only are they Latter-day Saints, I did a survey. There were 35 at least former members of bishoprics or stake presidencies. They aren't just Latter-day Saints, they're Latter-day Saint leaders that are up there. In the survey I did, 80 legislators were Republicans, and 74 of them, no, excuse me, 72 of them were Latter-day Saint men. There were 4 Latter-day Saint women and 4 among the Republicans. Democrats were evenly divided. There were as many men as women, they were equal, and there were as many Latter-day Saints as non-Mormons. They were equal. But overwhelmingly, 88%, the legislature's Republican, and that means overwhelmingly LDS. And the church tries not to bully the legislature, and the legislators don't want the church telling them what to do. They got elected, they'd like to make up their own minds, but it's part of Utah politics.
In the Q&A, I see a question from Dr. Alan Coombs, who taught political history at the University of Utah. And his question is, how does a Democrat like Ben McAdams manage to get elected to a congressional district with the biases that you have described?
Okay. There are 2 theories about McAdams' election, and both of them may be true. To begin with, Mia Love, while she had great virtues, the Republican incumbent, she wasn't a hustling politician. She was a little awkward in politics, and so that presented an opportunity. Next, McAdams ran in a year, theory 1, McAdams ran in a year when there were a lot of things in his favor. The 2 big ones were referenda on marijuana and Medicaid. That marijuana got young people out to vote, and young people tend to be more democratic. Medicaid got a lot of Democrats out to vote in that election, and while they were at it, they voted for Ben McAdams. Theory 2 is the Utah County Clerk was incompetent in that election. If you showed up to vote in Utah County, you sometimes had to wait 2 hours in line. A lot of Utah County voters went home. The Utah County turnout, according to this theory, because of that, was much lower than it would have been. Had Utah County voted, say, as efficiently as Salt Lake County, maybe the Republican would have won, because maybe there would have been a bigger turnout in Utah County. Both of those theories could be true, and in any case, Ben McAdams now faces a tough fight in this coming election.
Okay. I see in the chat box, 3 people have asked about Mormons' feelings about the current occupant of the White House and morality. Um, and that's I think a fundamental question here, where maybe there is a policy support for, say, economics, but the character, the behavior, the vocabulary, uh, the three wives caused a lot of dissonance among Utah Mormons. Could you speak to that?
Yes, that's the exception that proves the rule, as they say. Uh, Utah was the most Republican state in 7 of the last 11 presidential elections. It was nearly the most Republican state in the others, except for 2016. In 2016, Utah was the least Republican state that ended up in the Trump column. Trump won Utah with less than a majority. What happened? Latter-day Saints, who until then had voted 76% on average for the Republican candidate in every election we could tell, voted 32% of them voted for Evan McMullen, a BYU guy who had been in the CIA and had never run for office before. He ran as a third-party candidate. He got more than 30% of the vote in Utah, 7% of the vote in Idaho, and essentially no votes anywhere else. Latter-day Saints were very uncomfortable with Trump. They weren't uncomfortable enough to let Hillary Clinton win the state. But instead of being first, or as Utah usually was for the Republican, Utah was 29th, the least Republican state that was still Republican. I think maybe Trump will do a little better this time than he did last time. It would be my guess, but I don't know.
Okay. Rod, you just mentioned the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and for a number of years, about 15, I took University of Utah students to the CIA. They saw it as a recruitment opportunity. I saw it as an educational opportunity for students. I see a question from Dr. Lou Bordnick here. He says it is said that LDS people are particularly suited for jobs in the CIA. And I know that that's been true. CIA recruits very heavily in Utah. Why?
I guess that they follow orders and don't ask questions. I don't know. I don't know whether there's data. I don't know what the CIA says about it. But one would guess. I know Norman Mailer wrote a novel about the CIA, and he referred to the Mormons and the large number of Mormons in the CIA. There is an active group in Provo, clusters around BYU, of retired CIA people. It includes people from the State Department and so forth too, but a number of CIA people. It is true. I speculate that it's because Latter-day Saints, the returned missionaries, are clean cut and they may speak a language and they are friendly and try to get along. But that's just speculation.
Okay. I see two questions in the Q&A that I would merge. One dealing with the impact that both Cal Rampton and Ted Moss and Scott Matheson had as fiscal conservative, social moderate Democrats in Utah had going over 50 years ago, but also looking back upon the Secretary of Agriculture during the Eisenhower administration, Ezra Taft Benson. Did he have an impact in shifting Utah politics to the right?
Ezra Taft Benson is often credited or blamed with Utah's Republican politics. Jan Ships, for example, a scholar of Latter-day Saints of the church, says that it was because of Ezra Taft Benson, and a number of people believe that. I don't believe there's anything to that. I think that Jan Ships is clearly progressive and writes blaming um, Ezra Taft Benson. I think this, that Ezra Taft Benson was a long time ago. A number of people who now vote Republican in Utah would scarcely know who he was. His conservatism was different from the current conservatism. And so I don't think, I mean, he told people to vote Republican, and I'm sure some of them did, but that was a long time ago, and I think his influence is gone. It's true that before 1976, Utah had Democrats, and you mentioned Cal Rampton, Frank Moss, Scott Matheson. Scott Matheson was even after the change. It took a while for the change to trickle down through Utah politics, and eventually after Roe v. Wade, Utah never voted for another Democrat for president or for senator. But we had Scott Matheson as governor. We had one Democratic legislature, and we've had Democratic congressmen and attorneys general, a few, not so many. I think it's not been personalities. This has gone on, the Latter-day Saint Republicanism has gone on long and deep. And I think the cause has to be long and deep.
Okay. Rod, I see in the Q&A some questions about race, that sensitive subject of race. This year we've been seeing protests dealing with systemic racism. The LDS Church for years, prior to 1978 June, was severely criticized outside of Utah for its policies with regard to race. Could you speak to how that has been associated with conservative Republican politics?
They changed on race about when Utah changed politics. And in Utah, there aren't a lot of African Americans. Utah has about half the percentage of minorities. In America, it's about 40%. In Utah, it's about 20%. And most of the Utah minorities, but the majority of the minority are Hispanics, Latinx people, some Native Americans, a few African Americans. The second most after Latinx are islanders, Polynesian people. So I don't know that race affected Utah politics very much. Nowadays, the Latter-day Saint leadership makes remarks against racism. I don't know that Utah is a particularly unracist state. There was on the internet, I saw a rating of systematic racism, and Utah was in the middle. It didn't go the way I'd expected. Some of the most racist states were northeastern states or Midwestern states, Wisconsin, by this particular way of counting. Utah was about in the middle.
Okay. Related to this is the subject of gender. This year is a year in which Utah will choose a new governor, white males. And historically, Utah has never had a woman elected governor in her own right. Mm-hmm. In 2004, May, I was walking around the Republican State Convention when Olene Walker, the incumbent, having become governor when Mike Leavitt left to go to Washington, I heard older white men with delegate badges say, "I just can't vote for that girl." That girl was Dr. Olene Walker, 61 years old, a grandmother and former state legislator. I heard that expressed several times as I was just walking around listening. What about this matter of gender in Utah politics and governing?
Utah is backwards with respect to gender. As you say, we don't elect so many women. We're behind. We're not the bottom, but we're behind. We're below average in terms of the number of women legislators and the number of women elected officials. Moreover, maybe more importantly, there was a study last year, and there have been a lot of studies, they say essentially the same thing. The study last year said Utah has the second largest pay gap between men and women of any state. And a number of studies have said something about like that we have a large pay gap. Moreover, our pay gap reflects an education gap. In America, generally, women go to college and get degrees more than men now. Utah has the largest pro-male college attendance and degree gap of any state. So the difference in pay reflects some difference in education. There are anecdotal stories. I don't know, I don't have any data, but the anecdotes are a Latter-day Saint young woman goes to college, then she quits after 2 or 3 years because her returned missionary comes home, they get married, she goes to work and supports him to get a degree and support the family. That's a Utah stereotype, and it may in part be true. Moreover, Utah women have more children, as I said, than other women. There was a study by Paula England and somebody else, I don't remember the other author. It was called The Mother Penalty. Every child reduces a woman's average wages by 7%, average income. That's not true for men. Utah women have more children and therefore lower incomes with respect to men.
Okay. So I think on the average, somewhere between 70 cents to 75 cents on the dollar.
Yeah, let's see if I can remember. I think it was 90 in America and 80 in Utah. It's gone up a little, but I don't remember the exact numbers. You may be right. It might have been 75.
Okay. See a question here with regard, is Utah on course to lose its LDS majority someday? What do you see as the consequences of higher education of non-LDS growth in Utah? And I might interject the fact that we're in Salt Lake County. Salt Lake County is about 41% of the state's population of approximately 3.2, 3.3 million right now. And my understanding is that now a majority of the residents in Salt Lake County self-identify as non-LDS, in contrast to Utah County, right to the south, the fastest growing county. And we see this issue coming up with the wearing of masks.
The LDS population in Utah has declined. Now it has been lower. It was lower in, the lowest it's ever been was in the first decade of the 20th century and around there. The general rule is that as Utah's, it depends on Utah's economy in comparison to the United States economy. When Utah's economy grows faster, people move in, and people moving in are more likely to be Gentiles, non-Mormons, than the people already here. And so the percentage of Latter-day Saints goes down. No one knows the percentage of Latter-day Saints in Utah. The census, of course, is forbidden to ask, and there are various ways of counting and measuring, and they don't agree. I think maybe about 60% now, or maybe a little lower, and it is going down. It will have to go down quite a bit to turn things politically. It will make gradual differences, but it'll have to go down some. Latter-day Saints turn out to vote considerably better than non-Mormons. Latter-day Saints, they do their civic duty and they vote. And Latter-day Saints vote Republican in higher percentages than non-Mormons vote Democratic. Latter-day Saints are the group, maybe the group in America that votes most Republican, more than the rich, more than the old, by some measures more than evangelicals, not by all, though they vote, Latter-day Saints vote less Republican than academics and African Americans vote Democratic. They're both more strongly Democratic than Latter-day Saints are Republican.
Okay.
I wanted to say one other thing.
Sure.
He or she asked about higher education. The more education a Latter-day Saint has, the more likely he or she is to be faithful. Latter-day Saints tip sort of the usual way, and so higher education may help the Latter-day Saints.
Okay. Utah has a Republican Party that is very broad, at least in name, but also very divided. The Republican Party has an establishment wing, and it has an extreme right wing that maybe 50 years ago we associated with the John Birch Society. Today, more likely with folks who support militias, libertarians, people who are gun owners. The Republican Party potentially can become so broad that it could potentially lose its power if the Democratic Party and independents are united?
Yes, the Republican Party is broad and divided. So is the Democratic Party, broad and divided. In opposition, parties tend to coalesce, to pull together. Long periods of power tend to make parties more diverse. Yes, it's certainly possible that Republicans could split, especially in Utah. They have sort of split already. There is a sort of right-wing Republicanism that one sees particularly in the state Republican convention, and a sort of establishment Republicanism with people like Mike Leavitt, who put up, I think, $500,000 of his own money to gather signatures so that the convention didn't get to pick the nominees, and so that you could have signatures and get on the ballot. And they went to court for a long time. It could divide in Utah, but so far it hasn't, and I don't know whether it will in the future.
Okay. Mitt Romney, now the junior senator from Utah, 72 years old, and votes with the current occupant of the White House about 80% of the time. And yet now his popularity, according to public opinion polls, is less than 50% approval rating. Is Mitt Romney an example of the division within the Republican Party? Remember, he was booed at the convention by many supporters who supported a Utah County candidate.
A long, honorable tradition of getting booed in the Republican convention. Orrin Hatch was booed in the Republican convention. Mike Leavitt was booed in the Republican convention. Mitt Romney has company. Mitt Romney votes with the president a lot, but Mitt Romney does a lot of high-profile criticism of the president too, and he voted to kick him out of office. He voted to convict him in the impeachment proceedings, the only senator who did that. I think that Mitt Romney's low approval among Republicans is because in that respect, in his public criticism and in that vote, he was not a team player. And I think that's being held against him by some Republicans.
Okay.
On the other hand, I note in the question, his vote to convict was not mentioned. Democrats tend to forget the vote to convict.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a personal question. At the back of your book, there's identification that you served in Army intelligence during the Vietnam War. But I have not found in the content of your book anywhere where you acknowledge that fact. And
I put it on the back. I'm not hiding it.
Oh, no. So my question is, your book is so well researched and documented. how did you apply your skills that you learned in military intelligence to being a journalist? That is, trying to discover facts that, say, Utah politicians and lawmakers wanted to keep secret.
Well, there's a joke. Military intelligence is a contradiction in terms. The main thing I learned in military intelligence is I learned two things. First is we don't know anything. Secondly, the secret stuff is just as dull as the public stuff. That's what I learned in military intelligence. And the main thing is when you learn, I served in military intelligence, is you begin to understand why we lost that war.
That's right. Some personality questions in the last 5 minutes we have. As a political reporter, who has been the most interesting politician you covered and why? And as a political reporter, who was the worst rascal public figure that you've covered?
Oh my goodness. I like politicians, and I have liked almost all the politicians whom I covered. I especially liked Utah governors. I think we've had good governors, and we've, as evidence, Utah is tied for the most chairs of the National Governors Conference with Virginia, for the most. 7 Utah governors have been chair, elected by their peers. Utah's had good governors, and they've been nice guys. I've liked them. Who was the worst rascal? I don't know who was the worst rascal. There was a guy who was auditor of the Salt Lake County, and I can't remember his name, and he was finally booted out of office. He was a fairly bad rascal.
Wow. We have about 3 minutes left or so. What would you like to conclude with? Closing thoughts?
Well, I'd like to say thank you to the Unitarians. You guys read the Bible, and there's the leaven in the Bible. We need leaven and salt, and you guys are the leaven and the salt in Utah politics, or at least part of it. You keep politicians honest. You bring up alternatives and different ways of doing things, and you do so with a certain amount of class and civility, and I very much appreciate that.
Okay. Well, Rod, again, thank you. Thank you. Before closing, a last reminder about our coffee hour gathering to follow. Please use the Zoom link that is in the chat box that you can see on the screen, or find the link in the Torch email or the church website for the First Unitarian Church. The password is coffee, and that's lowercase COFFEE, all lowercase. And if all else fails, send me an email and I will send it to you. Our church service has concluded. I will now extinguish the chalice. As we close, a quick reminder about next week, August 16th. Dr. Gerald Lazar will be our 8th and our last 2020 Summer Forum speaker. Jerry has been a psychiatrist in private practice since 1970. He has specialized in depression, personal depression, and bipolar disorders, focused upon diagnoses and misconceptions. The title of Dr. Lazar's presentation next Sunday, August 16th, will be, quote, Depression and Bipolar Disorder, Defining Diagnoses, Case Histories, and their relationship to suicide prevention. Please join us next Sunday, August 16th. Thank you.